Well, good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Chosen People Ministries study on the book of Hebrews. As I said earlier, sorry I wasn't with you last week, but I know that Fiona has got you all the way to Hebrews chapter 2, verse 9. And tonight, what I hope we'll do is get to the end of chapter 2. And I just want to say a little kind of a little warning that we're talking here about family, and a family is full of joy and pain, often in equal measure. So if this is a sensitive subject for you, and if these labels are not positive necessarily, then I want to say from the start that what we're being presented with is the perfect family, the perfect father, the perfect son, and the perfect children, and the perfect world that we all yearn for. So I just wanted to say that before we started. And I want to read the text that we've got from chapter 2, verse 5. But as I said, we'll be looking really from verse 9 onwards. It is not to angels that he has subjected the world to come, about which we are speaking, but there is a place where someone has testified, what is mankind that you are mindful of them, Son of Man, that you care for him? You made them a little lower than the angels. You crowned them with glory and with honor, and put everything under their feet. In putting everything under them, God left nothing that is not subject to them. Yet at present, we do not see everything subject to them. But we do see Jesus, who was made lower than the angels for a little while, now crowned with glory and honor because he suffered death, so that by the grace of God, he might taste death for everybody. In bringing many sons and daughters to glory, it was fitting that God, for whom and through whom everything exists, should make the pioneer of their salvation perfect through what he suffered. Both the one who makes people holy and those who are made holy are of the same family. So Jesus is not ashamed to call them brothers and sisters. He says, I will declare your name to my brothers and sisters. In the assembly, I will sing your praises. And again, I'll put my trust in him. And again, he says, here I am and the children God has given me. Since the children have flesh and blood, he too shared in their humanity, so that by his death we might break the power of him who holds the power of death, that is the devil, and free those who all their lives were held in slavery by the fear of death. For surely it is not angels he helps, but Abraham's descendants. For this reason, he had to be made like them, fully human in every way, in order that he might become a merciful and faithful high priest in the service of God, and that he might make atonement for the sins of the people, because he himself suffered when he was tempted. He is able to help those who are being tempted. When I looked in the commentaries, when they first talked about verse 5 and talking about the world to come, they seem to, some of them seem to want to say that the world to come was the same as the latter days that the book began with. That they might be right, but when I hear this phrase, the world to come, what I hear in my mind is there's a place for every Jewish person in the world to come. It's in my mind, it's the world to come is the world we do not yet have. And I think Fiona would have been talking last week a little bit about this precise issue. The writer of Hebrews has almost restarted where he left off a couple of weeks ago. Are not all angels ministering spirits sent to serve those who will inherit salvation? So angels are ministering spirits sent to serve the people of God. And now we're learning more about these angels. And it is not the angels that he's put in charge of the world, but us. And that's the real thrust of Psalm 8, that is the first kind of text that's quoted. And Psalm 8 is a lovely psalm. It begins and ends with this, Lord, O our Lord, how majestic is your name in all the earth. But it's interesting because it follows a set of psalms that start with phrases like Psalm 6 starts with, Lord, do not rebuke me in your anger or discipline me in your wrath. Psalm 7, in Lord my God, I take refuge in you. Save and deliver me from the people who pursue me. Psalm 3, Lord, how many are our foes? Psalm 4, answer me when I call. Give me relief from my distress. Have mercy on me and hear me. So Psalm 8 is quite a jump. And then there's this wonderful description given to us about having set your glory above the heavens. Through the praise of children and infants, you've established a stronghold against your enemies to silence the foe and the avenger. Psalm 8 shows us that creation isn't all it should be, that there are enemies and foes, but that God is sufficiently confident in his abilities that he can have himself represented by the weakest part of society, by children. So this, you often hear this phrase, when a person and God is always the majority. And then we see, he says, when I consider the heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and stars which you've set in place. He's painting this, the enormity of our God and Creator, that he can, by the work of his fingers, almost without having to use his arms, it's just a delicate sort of tiny little operation to create and to work in the heavens. And then this phrase, what is man that you care for him? That you're mindful of him. Modern people like to talk a lot about mindfulness, about how it's good for us. And it's certainly good for us to remember that God is mindful of us. He remembers that we are dust. And he has he's made us a little lower. He made humanity rather a little lower than the heavenly beings and crowned them with glory and honor. And then he goes on to say, you made them rulers over the works of your hands and put everything under their feet, all the flocks and herds and animals of the wild, birds in the sky, fish in the sea, and all that swim in the sea. It's a picture of creation. It's a picture of the first call that God had on humanity as his co-regents of creation. And so once we've been through Psalm 8, we can again say, wow, how majestic is your name, that we should worship you just for the joy of how you've made us and for what purpose you've made us. But yet we don't see that. And the writer of Hebrews does an amazing thing, because he takes the psalm that is about humanity and he makes it about the Messiah. He takes a psalm, and it's the authority of this great authority of the New Testament writers to be able to take a psalm that is very clearly about humanity and make it about Jesus the Messiah. And the reason that he does that is because he wants us to see that Jesus, the Messiah, is the way to return to the order that we have lost. You'll see that as we kind of work through the text. In putting everything under them, God left nothing that is not subject to them. So in putting everything under the authority of the angels, he left nothing that was subject to them. And in putting, in putting everything under them, God left nothing that is subject to them. He put everything under our authority. Yet we don't see that as a reality, verse 8 ends in. But we do see Jesus, who was made lower than the angels for a little while, crowned with glory and honor because he suffered death, so that by the grace of God he might taste death for everyone. We learned in the first chapter that essentially that Jesus is superior to all the angels. But now we learn that for a little while, he's made lower than the angels. We're beginning to look at the incarnation. And we're going to see how God's purpose with the incarnation is to create an intimate relationship with his family. We see Jesus, who was made lower than the angels for a little while. So it's only for a temporary period. And now it says that he's crowned with glory and honor because he suffered death, so that by the grace of God, he might taste death for everyone. Crowned with glory and honor because of his willingness to be made lower. I was thinking this is a bit like John the Baptist, who recognized that if by making himself lower, he raised up Jesus, that was a good thing, a right thing, a righteous thing. But here we see beyond the death, the incarnation and the death of Jesus, and into what Fiona has probably described in Daniel 7, the Son of Man who came and was given all authority and power and dominion. And if you read on in chapter 7, you would see that the sovereign power and greatness of the king was handed over. He hands over an everlasting kingdom, which is ruled by the saints. So the rescued people of God in the new kingdom will finally together rule as God has intended in Genesis 1:27. And we're told here that he did this by suffering death, so that he might taste death for everybody. Jesus is going to be described as a pioneer. It's in some translations it says the author or the authority or the leader or the head. Jesus is the head who becomes the human that Adam failed, the head that Adam failed to be. He is described by Paul as the second Adam in 1 Corinthians 15:45-49. So if he had not become flesh, of course he could not have died. If he could not have died, then he couldn't have made atonement for our sin. And that is the sense in which he tastes death for everyone. That in the ancient world, there was a terrible fear of death and what lay beyond death. And in our modern world, well, instead of having a terrible fear of death, what we do is ignore it or trivialize it. But those of us who experience death know its power and know its impact on our hearts, on our emotions, on our relationships. But the fact that Jesus is now crowned with glory and honor teaches us that he has come out of death and into glory. And that's why verse 10 is so wonderful. In bringing many sons and daughters to glory, it was fitting that God, for whom and through whom everything exists, should make the pioneer of their salvation perfect by what he suffered. The gospel, the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, our Messiah, brings sons and daughters to glory. Not now, in part now, and in perfection in the world to come. So what does it mean when it says it was fitting that God should make the pioneer of the salvation perfect through what he suffered? What does it mean that it was fitting? Well, fitting in this sense means appropriate, the right. If you think about, I don't know if you've ever been in the situation of being you're working on a car engine, and there's a bolt that's a particular size, and you're searching around for the right spanner or wrench to grab hold of it. And when you find the right piece, it makes the job easy. Suddenly the nut turns and everything's fine. Without the right spanner, it's either too big or too small, and you get nowhere. Jesus is I don't mean this disrespectfully, the right spanner for the nut of salvation. That's what we're being told here. And we're also being told that the only person who could be the right spanner for the nut of salvation is the one through whom and for whom all things were made. This text completely rules out any form of works, of human works. Isaiah says that all our good works are filthy rags. That they are, all our good works are menstrual cloths. And the reason he uses that particular description is because the sight of blood is intended to focus the mind on death and life at the same time. So we have the death of the lamb whose blood is put over the door at Passover, and we have both death and life simultaneously together in one thing. And should make the pioneer of their salvation perfect through what he suffered. So the question is, we believe that the Son of Man took on human flesh and lived with us as the perfect human. So how can suffering make him perfect? Where would we be if the Son of Man had never become human? How would he have understood pain? How would he have understood weakness? The incarnation opened that to him to experience. I always think of the story of Jesus at the well with the woman caught in adultery. He must have been strange, feeling tired, feeling hungry, feeling sickness. For the second person of the Trinity, who had until that point spent eternity in perfect relationship with the Father and the Spirit. But he became a perfect lamb for us because he's more than just a sacrifice. He's also a priest. He's also someone we can turn to. So he brings us to glory and does it verse 11, both the one who makes people holy and those who are made holy are of the same family. It's a very, it's very much the thinking in John's Gospel in chapter 17, where you hear Jesus praying about wanting the same glory for the disciples as the glory that he had with the Father before creation. The one who makes people holy and the ones who are made holy are of the same family. The transformation that the gospel brings in us lifts us up to the same likeness as this son. I'm just looking for my reference, but where's it gone? 1 John 3:2. What will be has not yet been made known, but we know when Messiah appears, we shall be like him, for we shall see him as he is. Romans 8:25, we hope for what we do not yet have. And Paul tells us in Philippians 3:13 that we should forget what is behind, but strain towards what is ahead, which is this very idea. You know, he says, not that I've achieved it, not that I have reached that end, but I strain on forward towards this goal that is promised in the gospel of being made equal in nature to the Son, and to finally fulfill God's intention for humanity as outlined in Genesis 1 and as used in Psalm 8. So Jesus is not ashamed to call them brothers and sisters. He says, I will declare your name to my brothers and sisters. In the assembly, I will sing your praises. This is a quote from Psalm 22. And if you're anything like me, you'll be almost surprised by the choice of this little section. Why does he choose Psalm 22, verse 22? When we think of Psalm 22, we think of, my God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from me? So far from the words of my lips. I call out day by day, but you do not answer. And then we'll look on and see how the crucifixion is described in such detail. In verse 17, for example, I can count all my bones. The people stare and gloat over me. They divide my garments among them and cast lots for my clothing. The interesting thing is that Psalm 22 is the beginning of the praise section of that psalm. So just as Psalm 8 was the praise psalm that followed the my God, why have you forsaken me kind of psalms that went before it, so the same thing is true in Psalm 22. Because Psalm 22:22 is, he says, I will declare your name to my brothers. In the congregation I will praise you. You who fear the Lord, praise him. All you descendants of Jacob, honor him. Revere him, all you descendants of Israel. For he's not despised or disdained the suffering of the afflicted one. He has not hidden his face from him, but has listened to his cry for help. Psalm 22 sees that although it appeared that Jesus was despised and disdained, that actually his trust in God and in God's plan has not hidden his face for him, but has in fact brought him into his presence in Daniel 7 that Fiona talked about last week. And then, in fact, the rest of the psalm goes on to celebrate the praises of God to all the ends of the earth in verse 27, and all the families of the nations. So what begins as a celebration for Jacob and Israel becomes a celebration for the whole earth. That's the picture of the second half of Psalm 22, and that's what the writer of Hebrews is trying to show us. And when we see this phrase, when I see this idea, I'll declare your name to my brothers and sisters in the assembly, I will sing your praises. I think of Luke 4 and Jesus in the synagogue teaching his brothers and sisters the Torah. In fact, in Luke 4, he's teaching about himself from the book of Isaiah, the very prophet that we're about to see quoted. So you see again, here is a phrase, I'll declare your name to my brothers and sisters in the assembly, I'll sing your praises. And again, I will put my trust in him. And again, he says, here I am and the children God has given me. Now he's in Isaiah 8. Now he's in Isaiah 8. And again, it's interesting to see the choice of verse that he's picked here. He's picked 17. I will wait for the Lord who is hiding his face from the house of Jacob. We just had in the psalm this idea of God hiding his face from us and now turning his face to us. And here in Isaiah, what we're seeing is the prophet making a commitment of faith in the face of not having contact with God. It's the picture of a disciple being so convinced of God's promises and his past performance that even when God appears to be silent, he will choose to wait for God to reveal himself. You know, it's like that, the phrase, be still and know that I'm God. In fact, in Jeremiah, he says he'll lead us to a crossroads and ask us to choose a way. But very often we need to wait on the Lord for the right way. And again, he says, here I am and the children God has given me. For some reason, the writer of the Hebrews wants to split this verse in two. What it does is it shows us first that trust, waiting for God and trusting him in the silence, is part of the life of the disciples. Maybe the church that heard this letter for the first time felt that they had been abandoned by God. Maybe they were having a hard time and they felt as if God was hiding his face from them. And so as they turn to Isaiah 8, they can see that being faithful when God appears to be hidden is part of the life of the disciple from the very beginning. They can see themselves in the line of Isaiah and Jeremiah and the other prophets of many of the great people of faith who are outlined in Hebrews 11 that we're going to be heading towards. And again, he says, here am I and the children God has given me. This is the prophet talking about his children, who he describes as signs and symbols in Israel from the Lord Almighty who dwells on Mount Zion. But Hebrews makes it about the Messiah. Here I am and the children God has given me. It's the picture of the Messiah, the Son of Man, the Son of God, bringing his children together as his reward. In John's Gospel, you see God and his children. In John 6:37, we've got this phrase, all that the Father gives to me will come to me, and I will never drive them away. So in John 6:37, Jesus says that the Father will give him a people that he'll never drive away. And then in the Good Shepherd section in 10:27 to 29, my sheep will listen to my voice. My Father has given them to me. Nobody can snatch them from my Father's hand. I and the Father are one. It's a picture of first God's initiative in calling us to him, and then the security we have in him because he holds our hand. We don't hold his. And then lastly, as I think I mentioned already, in John 17, Jesus prays for his disciples, and he says, they were yours. The people were yours, and you gave them to me. And the book of Hebrews wants to say that this image of a family who are trusting God in the darkness of Isaiah 8 is a picture of the Messiah coming out of darkness into light. And so you see that even in Isaiah 8 and 9 as it transitions, talking about how the earth in 22 will be full of distress, darkness, and fearful gloom and utter darkness. And yet out of the darkness comes, for a people walking in darkness, a great light. And it's exactly the same ideas and images are being put together in Isaiah 8 and 9 and in this section here. Verse 14, since the children have flesh and blood, he too shared in their humanity, so that by his death he might break the power of him who holds the power of death, that is the devil. So I've already said that the Son of God had to become physically human so that he could die. And we see that since the children have flesh and blood, he came to share our humanity. And he came to share our humanity with one purpose, that is, death might break the power of death. The perfect Son of Man's death is the only sacrifice that can break the power of death and the devil, and set free those whose lives were held in slavery by the fear of death. For us, there's a challenge to think about, do we live lives in this light? Calvin, in his commentary on this, says that unless you believe, unless your life is committed to the next life, you're not truly a Christian. He's pretty shocking. But it is here for us to see, so that by his death he might break the power of the devil, break the power of death, and break the power of our flesh. So his death puts to death sin, death, and the flesh. And then verse 16, for surely it is not angels he helps, but Abraham's descendants. Abraham's descendants is another quote from Isaiah 41, verse 8 to 10. And it links back, doesn't it, to chapter 1, verse 14. It's not the angels he helps, but Abraham's descendants. The angels are there to help us, but somehow he goes ahead and goes before the angels. For this reason, he had to be made like us, fully human in every way, in order that he might become a merciful and faithful high priest in the service of God. The only way that the Son of Man could fully commit to his perfect task of being the perfect priest was becoming fully human, because unless he became fully human, he couldn't fully connect with us. And it's the role of the priest is to be an intermediary between God and mankind. between a holy God and his unholy people. So by becoming human, he became the merciful and faithful high priest in the service of God. See that it's not in the service of us, but in the service of God. We want lots of things, but what God wants is the best for us, and the best for us is as perfect relationship as we can have with him. And that leads to the second half of verse 17, where it says that he might make atonement for the sins of the people. We read in the first chapter that after he had provided purification for sins, he sat down at the right hand of the majesty in heaven, and so he became as much superior as the angels as his name is to theirs. It kind of brings this first section to a bit of a conclusion, but not before verse 18, where he says, because he himself suffered when he was tempted, he's able to help those who are being tempted. He understands how you feel in your suffering, in your pain, in your physical challenges, in persecution or rejection, in emotional abuse that you may have experienced. He knows it. I was thinking even today, my wife had a very difficult conversation with her sister. And she said her sister said some very hurtful things to her. And because of not only Jesus becoming flesh, but the way he suffered and died for us, he's the perfect high priest for my wife in that situation. So as I come to an end, I guess the questions we want to think about is how is Jesus has come from heaven to earth, become fully human, died for us, risen from the dead, and is ascended into heaven and is reigning and ruling. And one day that heaven will come down. How is that truth impacting our daily lives? Because we want this perfect priest. This perfect priest wants to be close to us. He wants to be removing our fears about the future. He wants to be manifesting his mercy when we feel like a failure. He wants us to know that he understands our suffering because he's shared it. And he wants to supply strength and stability to us because of where we're going. That's Paul says to us that he's striving on towards this goal that he's given us, this great promise in Hebrews chapter 2, verse 10, that he'll bring many sons and daughters to glory. And one day he will say to God, here I am, and the children you've given me. It's a wonderful promise, one that the Hebrews will continue to explore again and again. He wants to offer his help to comfort us in difficult circumstances, because he knows that trusting God, following him, is not in our nature. It is not easy for us, and it's one of the drivers in him becoming flesh, so that we could better trust him, better understand God. And that's why he says, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. You've seen what it means and what it looks like to live a life that's completely Torah observant. So I guess what we could do maybe is talk about whether we feel like he's a perfect priest, whether we have examples of him proving his faithfulness and how that has helped us in our daily lives. And I think that might be a good and useful discussion for us following on from this text.